The contractor looked at the cabin at 8:23 a.m. on a Monday and told the project manager it would take one afternoon to clear. He was standing at the edge of the dock with 2 workers and a clipboard, and behind him a crowd had gathered from the morning market. Women with baskets on their heads, 2 men with nets still dark from the early run, a boy on a bicycle who had stopped pedaling to watch. The contractor gestured at the old wooden structure and said something to the man beside him. 3 people in the crowd laughed. One of them pointed at the old man's blue shirt, which was torn at the left shoulder seam, and said something that made 2 more people laugh. The old man did not look up. He was sitting on an upturned plastic crate at the far end of the dock, writing in a small red notebook with a pencil worn down to 4 centimeters. He had been writing since 5:47 a.m., which was when he arrived at the dock, as he had arrived at the dock every morning for 44 years. The eviction notice had been taped to his cabin door since Thursday. He had read it once, replaced it with a fresh strip of tape, and returned to the notebook. No one in that crowd had ever been inside the cabin. No one standing on that dock at 8:23 a.m. knew they were 12 meters from 44 years of records that no institution on the coast of Ghana had ever produced. Nobody thought to ask what the old man in the torn shirt had spent those years writing down. His name was Kwesi Boateng. He was 73 years old. He weighed 63 kilograms, which was what he had weighed for the past 15 years, since the year he stopped going on the deep sea runs and began spending his mornings on the dock with a notebook instead. His hands were the particular kind of large that comes from a lifetime of hauling rope and net, knuckled and permanently salt-dried, with a ridge of hardened skin on the right palm, where the line had cut across it in the same place 3 times between 1978 and 1992. He smelled of the sea even on mornings when he had not yet been near it. Mineral, salt-dried, and faintly of the kerosene he used in the small heater during harmattan season. The smell having worked its way into the walls of the cabin, and from there into everything he owned. He moved without hurry, not slowly, without hurry, which is a different thing entirely. He wore one of 3 shirts on any given day. The blue one was the oldest, bought from a market stall in Cape Coast in 2006 for 4 cedis. It had torn at the shoulder seam in March when he caught it on the corner of the fireproof cabinet bolted to the cabin floor. He had not replaced it because the shirt was clean. He washed all 3 shirts in a bucket behind the cabin every Sunday evening and hung them on the line between the 2 pawpaw trees and let them dry overnight. Every morning the shirt he wore was clean. This was not something the crowd on the dock had thought to notice. The cabin itself had been built in 1973 by his father, who had been a fisherman before him. His father had received the land from the regional chief in a formal ceremony in October of 1961, 10 months after independence, along with a handwritten deed stamped with the chief's seal and witnessed by 2 elders and a district magistrate. The deed recognized the Boateng family's occupancy of 3.4 acres of waterfront land in the village of Amanful, on the coast west of Elmina, in perpetuity. The deed had been folded in a plastic sleeve inside an envelope inside a fireproof Chubb cabinet in the cabin since the year it was built. No one had moved it since. The cabin was 12 feet wide and 9 feet deep. From the outside it looked like what it was, an old wooden structure, its original gray-green paint reduced to patches, a tin roof seamed with rust along the ridgeline, fishing nets hanging along the east wall that had not been in water for 11 years. A rusted anchor propped against the south wall that Kwesi had retrieved from the seafloor in 1994 and kept because he liked its shape. From the outside, it looked like the home of a man the future had simply passed by. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Floor-to-ceiling shelving lined 3 walls, built from salvaged timber, sanded flat and sealed with alternating coats of engine oil and tung oil. On the shelves stood 44 notebooks, each numbered on the spine in permanent marker, Volume 1 through Volume 44. Volume 1 dated October 1980. Each notebook was 200 pages. College ruled. The kind sold at market stalls for 2.50 cetus each. They contained daily records of water temperature taken at the same 6 points along the shoreline at 5:45 a.m. and 3 Hope p.m. every day for 44 years. Wind direction and speed, estimated against a calibrated vane Kwesi had made himself in 1983 from a bicycle wheel and a strip of salvaged aluminum. Fish population counts, species by species. Using a visual census method he developed over 8 years of self-correction. Coral health notes, drawn in pencil, and careful cross-section diagrams. The date, intensity, and surge height of every significant storm that had struck the Amanful coast since October 23, 1980, he kept his pencils in a locked blue tackle box, which had been his since 1981. The lock was original. He wore the key on a piece of cord around his neck. He kept it locked not because the pencils were valuable, but because his wife, who had died 11 years ago, in June, on a Tuesday morning, had given him the box the day he started Volume 1. She had said, "If you're going to count the whole sea, you need a proper box for your tools." He kept it locked because she had touched the lock with her hands, and the habit of the lock was one of the small ways he continued to keep her company. He had no formal education past the primary certificate he earned in 1965 at the school in Amanful that no longer existed. He had never published anything. He had never held a government position or received a grant from any institution. What he had done was sit down at the end of a dock at 5:47 every morning for 44 years and write down what the sea was doing. Because someone had to, and because by 1983 or so it had become clear to him that no one else was. His goal on the morning the contractor stood on his dock was the same as every morning, to complete the 5:47 a.m. entry before the light shifted. Every morning, after the reading was done, he folded the top page of the notebook over and weighted it with the tackle box before standing. He had done this every single morning since 1981. He had never once left the dock without closing the book first. The development company was called Sunset Meridian Properties Ltd. They had arrived in Amanful 6 weeks earlier with an approved permit from the District Assembly to construct a 6.8-hectare luxury resort on the beachfront. The permit had been applied for in Accra, approved in Accra, and signed by a district official who had visited the site twice, for a combined total of 40 minutes. The resort footprint covered, among other parcels, the 3.4 acres on which Kwesi Boateng's cabin stood. The project manager's name was Dexter Agye. He was 36 years old. He drove a white double-cab pickup with the Sunset Meridian logo on the door. He wore construction boots that were clean, the visiting kind, not the working kind. He had posted the first eviction notice to the cabin door on a Thursday morning without seeing the inside of the structure, because the cabin had been locked and the old man had been on the dock. And Dexter had not been interested in the interior of a clearance item. He had offered 18,000 Ghana cedis in compensation. The 4 other fishing families along the beachfront had each accepted between 12,000 and 20,000 cedis and had relocated inland. Dexter had recorded these in his project log as successful negotiations. He had expected Kwesi Boateng to be the simplest case, the oldest, the most isolated, the most visibly poor. He had been wrong about this, but he would not know by how much until day 12. Among the crowd that gathered on the mornings when Dexter came to the dock, a man named Kolade stood at the back. He had worked deep sea runs beside Kwesi for 6 years in the 1990s. He had been on this dock every morning of his adult life. He did not laugh when others laughed at the torn shirt. He did not intervene either. He folded his arms and watched and went home. The woman who ran the provision shop at the harbor entrance, Pauline Mensah, 64 years old, with short gray locks and a way of looking at things as though she were measuring their exact weight, watched all of it from the stool outside her shop door. She had watched Kwesi Boateng on that dock every morning for 31 years. She said nothing to anyone. But she was measuring. On day 5 of the 14-day notice, Kwesi's son called from London at 9:16 p.m. His name was Emmanuel. He was 41 years old, had lived in the UK for 12 years, and he worked in transport logistics. His face on the WhatsApp video screen was the face of a man who had been rehearsing something he had not yet found a way to say out loud. The phone was propped against volume 32 on the shelf. The single lead bulb on its wire above the desk gave everything a yellow cast. "Papa," Emmanuel said, "take the money." Kwesi looked at his son. "The water was 27.4 degrees at 3 o'clock today," he said. "That is 1.2 degrees above the baseline for this week in the historical record. I still need to note it." Emmanuel pressed his hand flat against his forehead. "Papa, the cabin is going to be demolished in 9 days, I know," Kwesi said. "Then take the 18,000 cedis and go. You can stay with Auntie in Accra. Where would I put the notebooks?" Kwesi said. Emmanuel was quiet for 8 seconds. The sound of traffic came through on his end. A bus, distant. Then he said, "You cannot save notebooks, Papa. You cannot live in notebooks. Take the money and go." "The notebooks are not the cabin," Kwesi said. "The cabin is wood. The notebooks are 44 years of this water. They are not the same thing." The call ended at 9:31 p.m. Emmanuel called back at 9:44 p.m. Kwesi had already turned the phone face down and opened volume 44 to continue his evening entry. On day 7, Pauline walked the full length of the dock at 6:15 a.m. and set a tin container on the crate beside Kwesi, rice and sardines, still warm. She said nothing. She turned to leave. Then she stopped and, without looking back at him, said, "I have a number for someone. You want it?" "Who is the person?" Kwesi said. She turned around. "Someone you taught." "A long time ago. I saw her on the television last month. She was talking about the coast." The harbor light came in off the water at that hour, the way it only comes in before 7 a.m., sideways, hammered copper, the kind that makes the surface of the sea look solid. The air smelled of salt and diesel, and the overnight catch in the holding boxes at the dock edge. "She probably doesn't remember me," Kwesi said. Pauline looked at him with the measuring expression. "She named her daughter after this beach," she said. Then she went back to her shop. On day 10, the contractor returned with 3 workers and a surveying tripod and set up 8 meters from the cabin door. Dexter stood with the clipboard and made notes. The contractor pointed at the metal chimney on the cabin roof, the only chimney on the beachfront, installed in 1991 for the Harmattan heater, and told Dexter it would need specialist removal. Dexter noted it. He looked at the cabin once more. It still looked like a structure with nothing inside it worth considering. On day 11, a gray saloon car pulled up at 11:42 a.m. The district assembly official who stepped out was named Mr. Asante. He wore a white short-sleeved shirt, and he carried a briefcase, and he had the bearing of a man delivering an improved offer he expected to be accepted. He sat on the second crate and said the company had authorized an increase. 22,000 cedis and a new concrete block structure. 400 meters inland. 2 rooms, metal roof, already constructed. Kwesi looked at him. He said, "Bring me a form." Mr. Asante opened the briefcase. He produced an acceptance document. Kwesi looked at it for 4 seconds and placed it back on the crate between them. "Not that form," Kwesi said. "The form for requesting the original land registry transaction history for this plot, from 1961 to the present." Mr. Asante's hand stopped moving on the briefcase. "It is a standard form," Kwesi said. "The registry office in Cape Coast keeps copies. I am a landowner requesting a review of my original title. You can bring the form, or I can walk to Cape Coast myself. It is 40 minutes on foot." Mr. Asante looked at him for a long moment. He was not looking at the torn shirt now. He was looking at Kwesi's face, which had the particular quality of a face that has already made its decision and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. Mr. Asante closed the briefcase and said he would need to make some calls. He got back in the gray saloon and drove off the access road. At 2:18 p.m., Pauline picked up her phone outside the provision shop and made a call that lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. If this story is sitting on you the way I think it is, subscribe now, because what arrives at the Amanful harbor the following morning is what changes everything anyone in that village thought they understood about the old man on the dock. Dr. Nkechi Amara arrived at 7:04 a.m. On day 12, she drove a government-plated white Toyota Land Cruiser, and she was 47 years old, and she wore a gray EPA field jacket with the agency crest on the left chest. She was the director of the Ghana Environmental Protection Agency's Coastal and Marine Division. She had left Accra at 3:50 that morning, a drive of 3 hours and 14 minutes, because Pauline Mensah had called her at 2:18 the previous afternoon and had said, "Kwesi Boateng is about to lose his cabin. You need to come now." She had not been back to Amanful in 22 years. She was 7 years old the morning Kwesi Boateng found her at the waterline at 5:30 a.m. in 1984. Standing 30 meters from where anyone could see her, watching the way the water moved around a submerged rock. Her family had come from Accra for the holiday week. She had woken before anyone else in the house and come to the water because she could hear it from her window, and she needed to understand what it was doing. Kwesi had sat down beside her on the wet sand and told her. Not the simplified version adults gave to children. The full version, the tidal pull, the thermocline, the way the reef shelf changed the water's pressure above it, why fish schooled at that particular depth at that time of morning. He spoke to her the way you speak to someone whose question deserves a complete answer. She had stayed 2 hours. She missed breakfast. Her mother was standing at the road gate with her hands on her hips when she came back up. She had decided, on the walk from the waterline to the gate, what she was going to do with her life. She walked down the dock to where Kwesi sat at his crate. He looked up from the red notebook. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her face for a long moment. "You are taller," he said, "but you still come before the light changes." She put her hand on his arm. She said, "Show me." He unlocked the cabin. He pulled the cord on the bulb. She stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 walls of shelving. She stood there for 41 seconds without speaking. "How many years?" she said. 44, Kwesi said. Volume 1 begins in October 1980. There is a gap of 3 weeks in August 1989 when my wife was in hospital. Otherwise, there is no gap. She walked to the shelves and removed Volume 1 carefully, the way you handle something whose age you can see. She opened it to the first page. His 1980 handwriting, smaller and more cramped than now, ran in a precise grid across the ruled lines. 6 measurement points, 2 daily readings, temperature and wind, and a notes column. She turned to the volume's middle. The same. She turned to the last page. The same. She replaced it and took volume 22 from the shelf. She opened it and closed it and put it back. She turned and looked at the fireproof cabinet on the floor. "Is the deed in there?" she said. "Since 1973, Quessy said." She stood with this for a moment. Then she said, "The EPA lost all pre-2012 coastal baseline records in the Accra flood. The Marine Research Institute in Tema has been requesting historical water temperature and reef health data for this section of coast for 4 years. We have nothing. Our oldest existing record for the Amanful Shelf begins in January 2013. She paused. "You have the 1980s, you have the 1990s, you have the 2000s, you have everything." She took out her phone. Before she dialed, she said one more thing. She said she had read the environmental impact assessment submitted by Sunset Meridian Properties Ltd. On the drive down, having requested it from the district assembly at 4:30 that morning. The assessment reported reef proximity as 800 meters from the proposed construction footprint. Quessy's records showed the reef shelf came within 340 meters of the waterline at the site's northern boundary. Measurements taken at the same coordinates at multiple tidal states across 4 consecutive decades. The EIA had not been conducted during a neutral tidal period. The reef proximity figure in it was incorrect by 460 meters. An environmental impact assessment with a material inaccuracy of that scale was legally challengeable. Without accurate reef proximity data, the building permit could not be defended. She dialed the EPA regional director. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The contractor arrived at 8:15 a.m. on day 14. He came with his 3 workers and a yellow excavator that had been brought to the site on a flatbed truck the previous evening and parked on the access road. Dexter Aguirre stood beside his pickup in the clean construction boots. The demolition clearance form was on top of his clipboard. On the cabin door was an EPA suspension notice. It had been posted at 6:47 a.m. by a field officer from the Cape Coast Regional Office. It was an official document, 21 by 30 centimeters, green bordered with the agency crest at the top. It read, "Construction A&D clearance activities suspended pending environmental compliance review, effective immediately." Reference, EPA/CMR/AML/2024-0083. Parked beside Pauline's provision shop was the white Land Cruiser. Dexter looked at the notice. He looked at the Land Cruiser. He looked at the contractor. The excavator sat on the access road with its engine off and its arm in the air at a 45-degree angle, as though it too had been stopped mid-motion. Dr. Nkechi came out of the cabin at 8:22 a.m. carrying Volume 7, the 1986 log, open to the April section. She was cross-referencing something in it against her tablet. She walked to the dock and looked once at the excavator, then at Dexter. "The suspension is in effect," she said. "Nothing on this site moves today." Dexter said, "Who authorized?" "The regional director." She did not look up from the tablet. "You can reach him at the Cape Coast office after 9 a.m. The EIA submitted by your company will require resubmission with corrected reef proximity data. The building permit has been suspended pending re-review by the District Assembly under Section 12 of the Environmental Assessment Regulations. You are welcome to have your lawyers contact my office." She said all of this with the particular flatness of someone reciting facts they have already confirmed. Dexter's hand came off the clipboard and dropped to his side. He looked at the cabin, still standing, its roof catching the morning light the way it had been catching it since 1973. He looked at Quessy at the end of the dock, sitting on his crate, writing in the red notebook at 8:23 a.m., as though the events of the past 14 days had taken place in a room he had not been in. Dexter got into the white pickup. He drove off the access road. The excavator stayed on the road. The excavator driver sat in his cab and looked at the water. 6 weeks after that morning, following a full EPA compliance review, during which Kwesi's 44 volumes were used as the primary baseline for reef proximity mapping, the Sunset Meridian building permit was formally revoked. The district official who had approved it without a site-level environmental review was placed on administrative inquiry. The company was required to fund an independent reef health assessment of the Amanful coastal shelf as a condition of any future permit application in the region. The assessment was to be conducted over a minimum period of 18 months, with data submission to the EPA's Coastal Division. Kwesi's land deed was formally entered into the National Land Registry in Cape Coast on a Friday. The official who processed it told his colleague it was one of the oldest unregistered customary deeds he had seen converted to formal title in his career. He said this to his colleague, not to Kwesi, because Kwesi was not present. Kwesi was on the dock at 3 p.m. taking the afternoon water temperature reading. A team of 3 researchers from the Ghana Marine Research Institute arrived the following month to begin digitizing all 44 volumes. They said the work would take 5 days. They stayed 11. On the last evening, the youngest of the 3, a woman of 26 who had expected to spend her time entering data from old notebooks, sat with Kwesi on the dock as the sun came down and the harbor filled with the smell of coal pot smoke from the market stalls and the salt wind off the open water. She asked how he had known, in 1980, that the records would one day matter. He looked at the water for a moment. He said, "I didn't know they would matter. I knew the sea was changing. And I thought, someone should write it down." They taped a notice to his door and laughed at his shirt, and waited for him to accept the money and leave. They stood 12 meters from 44 years of records and saw a clearance item in a wooden structure with a rusted roof. What they could not see, what none of them had thought to look for, was that inside that cabin, behind a locked door, on shelves built from salvaged wood, was the most complete record of a living coastal ecosystem that anyone on the Ghana coast had ever compiled. Not because Kwesi Boateng had been building a case. Not because he had known in 1980 that the sea would need defending one day. Because he had sat down at the end of a dock at 5:47 every morning for 44 years and written down what he saw. With a pencil worn to 4 centimeters in a notebook that cost 2.50 cedis, because the sea was changing and someone had to be honest about it. The things a person has spent a lifetime building are not always visible from the outside. A locked cabinet is not a confession of emptiness. A torn shirt is not a record of what the person inside it knows. The world reads surfaces because surfaces are available and quick. What lies behind them takes longer. 44 years longer, sometimes. But it does not disappear because no one has noticed it. It keeps its records. It arrives at the dock before the light shifts. It waits. The morning the last researcher drove out of Amanful on the way back to Tema, Kwesi rose at 5:47 a.m. He unlocked the blue tackle box with the key on the cord around his neck. He took out a pencil. Volume 44 was nearly full. He had ordered Volume 45 the week before from the same stall in Cape Coast that had supplied every volume since Volume 8. The same kind. 2,050 CDs. They had been surprised when he ordered it. They did not know why. He walked to the end of the dock and sat on the crate and opened the notebook and wrote the date and the time and the water temperature, which was 26.8 degrees at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. In the dry season. The harbor light came off the sea sideways, hammered copper. The way it came every morning, the air smelled of salt and the particular green certainty of a coastline that had been counted and recorded and finally kept. Behind him, on the cabin wall, someone on the research team had applied a small square of fresh gray-green paint. the same color as the original, matched from a photograph in Volume 1, where Kwesi had noted the color of his father's cabin on the day he took over its care. They had painted it without asking and without announcing. He had noticed it on the morning they left and had not said anything. He closed the notebook when the 5:47 entry was complete. He folded the page and weighted it with the tackle box. He sat for another moment with the key on the cord in his hand. Then he put the key back around his neck and got up and went to work. "I want to ask you something. Not about the cabin, not about the records. If you have spent years carrying something that no institution noticed, something you kept because it mattered to you, because someone had to, because the thing you were recording was real even when no one was asking, what would you have done when the notice appeared on the door, when the son called from London and said, 'Take the money and go'? When the contractor looked at your life's work and called it one afternoon's clearance? Would you have stayed? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooked until they changed everything. I'll see you in the next one.